Helldivers 2 was not supposed to become this kind of story. When it launched in early 2024, it felt like one of those rare multiplayer hits that just works. The kind of game where everything aligns at the right time. The co-op was chaotic but satisfying, the gunplay felt impactful, and the tone hit a perfect balance between satire and intensity. Players weren't just enjoying the game, they were participating in it, turning every mission into a shared narrative about spreading managed democracy across the galaxy. Very quickly, Helldivers 2 became a massive success. It sold millions of copies and built a highly engaged community that wasn't just playing the game but actively discussing it, shaping strategies, and reacting to every update in real time. On paper, this is exactly what every live service game wants, but this is also where the problem begins, because a live service game doesn't stay the same. It evolves, it changes, and every change creates friction between the people making the game and the people playing it. Helldivers 2 is now one of the clearest examples of that friction turning into an ongoing conflict. If you look at the core of the tension, it almost always comes back to balance. Over time, Arrowhead introduced updates that adjusted weapons, stratagems, and enemy behavior. From a developer perspective, this is normal. A live game needs constant tuning to prevent dominant strategies from taking over and to keep the experience challenging. But from the player's perspective, those same changes often feel very different. Instead of seeing balance, players see restriction, weapons they enjoyed get weaker, strategies that once worked become less effective. The feeling of power starts to slip away. And when that happens repeatedly, the perception shifts from the game is evolving to the game is being taken away from us. This isn't just speculation, you can see it directly in community discussions. Large threads on Reddit and Steam forums consistently repeat the same sentiment, that each balance update makes the game feel less fun, more limited, and more frustrating to play. Players aren't just reacting to individual nerfs, they are reacting to a pattern. At the same time, the developers have tried to explain their approach. Arrowhead has stated that balanced decisions are made as a team, not by a single person making arbitrary changes. The intention is to create a healthier long-term experience, not to punish players. This has been mentioned in interviews and coverage from outlets like GamesRadar, where developers emphasize that changes go through internal discussion and oversight rather than impulsive decisions. But here's the problem. From the outside, that explanation doesn't always build trust. In some cases, it does the opposite. If players feel like something is going wrong and they can't clearly see who is responsible or why decisions are made, it creates a sense that no one is truly accountable. And once that perception sets in, every update becomes suspicious. This tension didn't come out of nowhere. Helldivers 2 has already gone through multiple controversies that reinforce this dynamic. One of the biggest was the PlayStation Network account linking requirement on PC in 2024. When it was introduced, it triggered massive backlash, including review bombing on Steam. Eventually, the decision was reversed, but the damage to trust had already been done. This wasn't just a minor issue, it showed players that even a successful game could make decisions that directly conflict with its community. There were other moments too. Pricing controversies around crossover content, technical issues introduced with major updates, and even situations where cheaters interfered with the global war system to the point where developers had to step in and reset progress. Each of these events added another layer to the relationship between players and developers. And then we get to 2026, where the same pattern repeats itself, but louder. The most recent wave of backlash came after another series of balance changes and progression adjustments that many players felt crossed the line. Weapons that were considered reliable got hit with noticeable nerfs, enemy encounters became more punishing, and progression pacing started to feel slower for a lot of the player base. The discussion quickly escalated beyond "this patch is bad" into something more familiar. The idea that the developers are fundamentally out of touch with how people actually want to play the game. Once again, you could see the same phrases repeating across the community. They're killing the fun, they don't play their own game. Why fix what wasn't broken? And once again, the developers responded by explaining the intent behind the changes. The goal was to maintain long-term challenge, prevent the game from becoming trivial, and keep the experience engaging over time. But by this point, intent is no longer the issue, because this isn't about one patch. It's about a pattern that players have learned to expect. What makes this especially interesting is that Helldivers 2 is not failing in the traditional sense. It still has a strong player base, it still receives updates. People are still talking about it constantly. In fact, the conflict itself is part of what keeps the game relevant. And that leads to a bigger question. Why does this kind of conflict happen so often in live service games? The answer lies in something fundamental that most players don't consciously think about. When you play a live service game, you are not just consuming content, you are investing time into a system that is constantly changing. You are building skill, learning mechanics, optimizing strategies, and developing a sense of mastery. So when a developer changes the balance, they are not just tweaking numbers, they are altering the value of that investment. From the developer's perspective, balance is about maintaining long-term health. If one weapon or strategy dominates, the game becomes predictable. If the game becomes too easy, players lose interest. If there is no challenge, there is no reason to keep playing. But from the player's perspective, balance changes often feel like loss. The weapon you mastered is no longer as effective. The strategy you enjoyed is no longer viable. The time you invested feels devalued. This is where the core conflict begins. Players want consistency, reward, and a sense of power. Developers want challenge, variety, and longevity. These goals overlap, but they are not the same. In many cases, they directly contradict each other, and this is where the conversation often breaks down. You will see people argue that developers should simply listen to the players. On the surface, that sounds reasonable. After all, the players are the ones spending time and money on the game. But if you follow that logic to its extreme, it creates a different problem. Players tend to optimize for short-term enjoyment. They gravitate toward the strongest options, the easiest strategies, and the most efficient ways to win. If developers blindly follow that feedback, the game can quickly lose depth and challenge. On the other hand, ignoring players entirely is just as dangerous. If the community feels unheard, frustration builds, engagement drops, and eventually the game loses the very audience it depends on. So the real solution is more nuanced. Developers need to listen to players, but not in the way most people think. Players are very good at identifying problems. They can tell when something feels off, when something is frustrating, or when something stops being fun, but they are not always good at proposing solutions. That's the developer's job. The problem with Helldivers 2 is not simply that developers are making changes or that players are complaining. The problem is that the gap between those two perspectives is not being bridged effectively. When players say this isn't fun anymore and developers respond with this is necessary for balance, both sides can be technically correct, but if that gap is not addressed, it turns into conflict. And once that conflict becomes a pattern, it starts to define the game itself. Helldivers 2 is no longer just a co-op shooter about fighting alien threats, it is also a live case study of what happens when a successful game tries to evolve while its community resists that evolution. But here's the part that most people miss. This conflict is not a sign that something is broken. It's a sign that the system is working exactly as intended. Live service games are not static products. They are ongoing negotiations between developers and players. Every update is a decision, every reaction is feedback, and every controversy is part of that process. Without tension, there are no meaningful changes. Without changes, the game stagnates, and when a live service game stagnates, it dies. So the question is not whether developers should listen to players or whether players should trust developers. The real question is whether both sides can accept that this conflict is unavoidable. Because Helldivers 2 doesn't have a balance problem in the traditional sense, it has a relationship problem, and until that relationship improves, every patch, every nerf, and every decision will continue to feel like part of a larger war. Not on the battlefield, but between the people who made the game and the people who refuse to stop playing it. And if you've made it this far, you probably care about these kinds of stories as much as I do. So if you want more deep dives into what's really happening in gaming, consider subscribing to the channel. And if you think this video nailed the situation, leave a like, because it genuinely helps push this kind of content further.